Welcome to Holley History, where we discuss what you want to hear.
No fake news, no alternative facts.
Just history all the time.
This is Mike Crissman. I'm here with Nick DeMuro. Welcome to Holley History, where we discuss what you want to hear, coming to you live from the Holley Library. We'd like to start first off by thanking folks who have subscribed. We're up over 60 subscribers now. Many folks have listened in, and we want to thank staff and administration. We want to thank students, both current and past students, who have not only listened in but have submitted questions as well, and keep those questions coming. That's what keeps this podcast going, and hopefully hearing what you want to hear. So we have a little bit shorter podcast today, but on a special event.
So yesterday, November 30th, would have been, if he was able to live that long, I don't know if he would have wanted to, Winston Churchill's 143rd birthday. And I'd like to point out that he's a Scorpio, which I also am, and Theodore Roosevelt too. So my favorite presidents. There's a lot of good company there. So we're going to call this, I guess, our hashtag Cheers to Winston episode. Right now, people on Facebook and Twitter are sharing their favorite Winston Churchill quotes, and some good ones. I think we'll end with some of those at the end, just read them off. Some funny ones and maybe some serious ones, because there's some inspiring ones there too. Darkest Hour comes out, I want to say, this December, which is the film about Churchill during his first prime ministership. During World War II. Gary Oldman is playing Churchill. How do you think he's going to be in that role?
From what I've seen in the previews, I mean, he does a darn good job. He pulls it off really, really well.
Well, is he a method actor?
I believe so.
And yeah, so he's like that Daniel Day-Lewis type, where it's like, you call me this, you don't address me as my real name.
You live the part.
Which is like so hard on the family.
I can't imagine.
Like Daniel Day-Lewis talks about I had to thank my wife because I'm I go away for a year, basically, as a different person. So Churchill, we want to do a show on him today, and I'll be completely honest, I'm an Anglophile, so I'm a big Churchill fan.
I'll admit my bias. I don't know a whole lot about him, although I'm currently in the middle of reading a book.
Why don't you tell us about the book real quick?
It's a book called Franklin and Winston by John Meacham. It's a book outlining their willingness to work together during World War II, both leading up to American involvement and during, and then afterwards. Also really profiles their friendship, which is interesting because they both start off really not trusting each other, but their lives are run incredible parallels. And so I'm right now, I just got to the part, I finished the part last night where U.S. enters World War II. Mm-hmm. And up to that point, it's been Winston manipulating to a certain degree the Americans and Franklin Roosevelt into the Lend-Lease Act. Right. Bases for destroyers, naval bases for destroyers, and things like that. So it's been an interesting read so far. If you get a chance, check it out. It's more an academic read more than just sit back and read it in an evening. So, but very interesting, very enlightening. You see the parallels between those guys. I know we're going to talk a little bit about Churchill has a background in the Navy. So does Franklin Roosevelt. Both of them have very similar family backgrounds. The way that they grew up. They both become great orators. Both lead their countries through incredibly difficult times. So not surprising. It's an easy book to make a thesis statement and back it up. So
Churchill was a blue blood like Roosevelt when he was born. He started out as pretty well off, but did not have that great of a relationship with his parents. And that Churchill was often described later as kind of a cold father too, and husband at times. Do you find the most great, quote unquote, great men in history are like that?
Well, they tend to be. They're so focused on the things that are important to them.
Right.
Many times, family gets pushed to the background or to the side, and that's sometimes a really kind of a tragic thing because these folks that we look up to and admire are actually flawed as far as becoming a good family person. One of the things I've always thought was so interesting about Churchill, and especially his background, when in his childhood, he had an incredible stuttering problem.
Yeah.
And later becomes, one of the great speech writers, and not just writers, but to be able to perform a speech, and that's probably the best way to describe it. Because it's one thing to read the words on the paper, it's something else to put heart and meaning behind it to inspire people to do things.
Yeah.
So
kind of like Theodore Roosevelt was the same way. He was all sickly when he was young, and he projects this Theodore Roosevelt, that is not Franklin, projects the image of masculinity later on. And there's a lot of parallels between those two guys as far as for their own country. Well, Churchill was, we want to give you a little bit of background. The goal of this show is not to provide narrative history to completely tell you a story, although in the future we might do a podcast on our favorite historical figures, favorite historical stories, things of that nature. Churchill was a 2-time prime minister for Great Britain, and when he was young, he served in the army, various government positions from the admiralty and the navy, to exchequer, all types of things in the British government, and he eventually makes his way to the top and serves as that 2-time prime minister. And I think one of the most fascinating things about him is his ability to move from failure to failure. And he had a quote about this too that hopefully I can find it later. But his ability to move from failure to failure was just so impressive. And I think that's a cool thing for students to learn. I'll often talk about that too. And his mother, most people don't know this, his mother was American and his father was British. And I think that probably comes up in the book a little bit.
Yeah, it does.
His ties to the U.S. And he's one of these first, they called them transatlantic folks, like Theodore Roosevelt, who believed in locking arms with Britain. And you mentioned this earlier, Mike. It was key that he secures that Lend-Lease Act in World War II.
Well, it's important to Britain's survival.
Yes.
What's interesting, though, is at that point, Britain had a pretty good idea that Operation Sea Lion, that potential invasion of Britain, was most likely not going to happen. Mm-hmm. But it was still important for Britain to get that backing financially and military and material-wise.
I mean, the moat helps around your country.
No, it absolutely does. But Britain can't keep up production.
No.
They're
still limping out. They're limping out of the First World War still.
Oh, absolutely.
All of Europe is. It's a miracle that Britain and France are even somewhat able to stand. Because it's like that whole theme of the victor will suffer with the vanquished after World War I.
Right.
And the United States and Japan really are the only ones that come out unscathed. They're the only winners. Britain and France left from that permanent hangover from the First World War. And Britain knows it, and I think Churchill knew it right off the bat. Just that will to fight is totally crushed.
Well, I think what makes Churchill, too, an interesting prime minister is he's not a coalition prime minister.
No.
He is not a guy who's going to, during peacetime, get two parties to work together, or two or more parties to work together.
Right.
He is the guy you want in charge in a crisis, like World War II. And then what happens to him after World War II? He's gone. Mm-hmm. And then they bring him back for the Cold War, and then he kind of loses favor with the British public. So it's interesting in the fact that he's the right man for the right time.
Yeah.
But the right time is not always for that man.
Yeah.
That's
a good way to put it.
It's an interesting way to think about it.
Well, I mean, we're kind of in the World War II point here. I want to go back to the World War I Gallipoli, the first downfall of his career. I want to get back to that. He did call out Stalin and the Soviets right away. He was so critical of Roosevelt at Yalta for quote unquote selling Europe, away to Stalin and trusting in Stalin, whereas Churchill saw Stalin for what he was. And Churchill's dealings with Stalin are super interesting too, because those two will meet and have some colored meetings as well. I couldn't imagine just sitting with those big three at Yalta, listening to would you love to be a fly on the wall for those?
I would have been, although it's interesting if you do a lot of reading about Yalta. Franklin Roosevelt at that point is so sick. Mm-hmm. He really isn't able to be there for a lot of the meetings. So it's really a contest of wills between Stalin and Churchill, who I view as being a fly on the wall. I mean, those are two immovable objects, and with such different viewpoints on how the world should be. Not surprising then that they come up with what they do, which is essentially dividing Europe, and setting up the Cold War anyway. Mm-hmm. To a certain degree, I buy into that. The Allies sold out. Mm-hmm. And it leads to the Cold War, which leads to other problems around the world. Yeah. And I think that's part of what leads to the downfall of Churchill, at least after World War II. That's how people view it.
Now, some criticisms have been his colonial attitude, his attitudes on race. And there's that side of Churchill that you can certainly dive much deeper into. I'll be honest, it's one side that I'm not well versed on. I know it's there, that he had some very negative attitudes on race and certain things like that, which is to be expected of somebody of his stature, his blue blood nature. But for his own people, he was progressive on some things. In the 1950s, during that second term as prime minister, those mining reforms and those housing reforms, something you don't expect of a conservative in Britain. But he did switch parties a couple times, especially in that late 20s and 30s interwar period. He was a lost guy.
Well, he doesn't view the parties as a means to an end. He's just trying to make sure that he's working with folks who can get done what he wants to do. Which is why I said earlier, I don't see him as a coalition prime minister because you can't trust him to stay with you.
Yes.
He wants you to stay with him.
Right.
It's very much about what he wants and what he's looking for.
So back to kind of his early life, this is some of the stuff that most people don't realize about Churchill. So we kind of covered the big things. We got about 10 minutes or so left here. He served in the Hussars Cavalry in 1895 and in the Indian Northwest and the Sudan campaigns, and he's part of the last great British romantic cavalry charge, the Battle of Omdurman, and he talked about killing people and that he had to do that. And one of the interesting things too is, you have people who are Warhawks in government in the United States today. People that come to mind are like George W. Bush, who were criticized as being chicken hawks because they didn't actually fight. Usually you see this in the neoconservatives in the United States. Churchill's one of those guys, again, I draw the parallel because it's what I know, like a Theodore Roosevelt, who he talks war, he talks a tough game, but these are guys who backed it up. These are guys who served. They put on the uniform. They went and did things. And Churchill, we're going to get to now his failure at Gallipoli. During the First World War, he was looking for that quote-unquote, as he would say in the Second World, the soft underbelly.
Right.
The area they could hit the Central Powers, and they went after the Turks in the Dardanelles near Constantinople, if you're familiar. And the campaign ends up being a complete failure.
That's putting it mildly.
Yes, and Churchill's idea was to use the obsolete naval ships that when the 1906 Dreadnought class comes out, these ships are obsolete, and in Churchill's minds, they're assets to be, just like, let's use them. If the ships sink, it's not a big deal. Never mind the guys on the ships. That's that Churchill perspective anyways.
Well, I think he views the troops much the same way.
Yes, he does.
Using Anzac, Australian and New Zealand troops in coalition with the British. But I think he views the Anzac troops as an untapped resource, and therefore and goes that direction. He's an interesting guy because not only when you look at his tactics in World War I for going for that soft underbelly, he's a real proponent in World War II of doing the same thing, except he wants to drive into the Balkans.
Right.
He wants to go into Greece and Bulgaria and invade not Italy, but invade farther to the east. And he's overruled on that by mostly the American armies, not willing to take those risks. But his strategy sometimes I find questionable.
Yeah.
Like the places he's going, I think he's doing for ulterior motives rather than anything.
Well, I think the Gallipoli campaign on paper does not sound like a bad idea. Force the Straits, this naval fleet, if you lose it, it's not that big of a deal. There was a lot of the risks. They didn't want to lose that trump card they had over the Germans, which was the Navy. If they lost their Navy superiority, they lose the war. It's the one trump they have over Germany, because Germany certainly has probably the best land army at the time. Size, training, combined leadership, everything. So the plan is not a bad plan on paper in theory, but as we know, in theory, everything works out just fine. But Gallipoli ends up being a disaster, and the Turks, who can't seem to do anything right, defeat the British coalition with some French forces too, and absolutely, it just gives the Turks more morale, if anything.
I think it goes back to his background of misunderstanding and underestimating
the Turks.
Not just Turks, but any group that is not part of the British Empire itself.
Yeah.
In my mind, he underestimates people constantly.
Yep.
As to what they can accomplish.
Well, not Hitler. He didn't do it Hitler.
Hitler, but he's not in power when Hitler's
it's
making that rise.
It's easy for him to say.
Right, absolutely. And it's really easy for him to say when he's not the prime minister in charge of everything.
Yeah.
And it becomes way more clear after the invasion of Poland. But yeah, no, that's absolutely right.
So after Gallipoli, he ends up going to serve with the Royal Scots Fusiliers as lieutenant colonel. Spends 100 days in the front at the trenches in a relatively quiet sector, but relatively quiet sector of the Western Front is still not the place you want to be. His wife was so upset with him that he went too. And if you think about it, he's newly married. He got married in 1908, I believe. He has children. I would be upset with him too. And there's that example of the father and the husband, that he's more concerned with revitalizing his image and who he is than being home. And he's older at this point.
Right.
He it's like Roosevelt.
He's trying to prove himself as still a young guy.
I think he also wants to be like, if I'm going to advocate for these policies, I have to have the record to do it, regardless of my safety. He goes 30 times in no man's land, on different occasions for different missions, and by all accounts was a fairly decent soldier. In the 1930s, he has that period where he's sort of labeled an extremist, and he actually shifts political parties quite a bit. I skipped over this one. One more thing. During the Boer Wars, I never knew this. He gets captured during the Boer Wars. He's serving as a reporter, gets captured, and makes this daring escape. And in perfect Churchillian fashion, has the reporters waiting for him when he gets off the boat, and he comes back as that publicity thing. And he did make quite the daring escape and managed to find the one British house in the area he was in. They knocks on the door.
And then you wonder then too about the story and how much of it is
of
embellished,
course.
right?
Yeah. I mean, he was the guy to do it. But a fascinating character, and the drinking. Some people, there's been books written about him.
The book I'm reading, there's actually there's a discussion about so the U.S. enters World War II.
Yeah.
Churchill comes over almost immediately after the attack on Pearl Harbor to kind of work out logistics with the president, and the White House staff is stunned at the amount of scotch that he puts down in a day, much less the entire trip that he's there. And that not only that, but the number of cigars. They were absolutely just flabbergasted. Probably by modern standards, he would have been an alcoholic,
right?
But he somehow made it work.
It was all part of his image. There's a great there's actually a whiskey glass that I think you can buy, and I think it says something. He said something effective it's better to be full of whiskey than bullets, but something I can't remember how it goes, but it is funny. So that brings us, I think, to the quote portion of our show. Oh, one more thing. BBC 2002, greatest Briton of all time, Winston Churchill.
Not surprising.
I kind of was shocked they picked him. I really was. I thought they'd go for a more progressive figure.
Well, I don't know. He not only leads the British, he inspires the British.
Well, I agree. I think he's the greatest Briton. I agree. I really do.
As a historian, if you read a little bit about him, he is well read.
Yes.
Not only in fiction, in politics, but he's a very good historian as well. And he liked to fancy himself.
Yes.
As a Nelson from Trafalgar.
Yes, he did.
He really kind of lays out the idea during especially the beginning of World War II, where Britain's really struggling, that the people of Britain are to do their duty to the cause, just like Nelson challenged his men at Trafalgar to do your duty for the empire, right? And I think he sees himself in that role completely and sells himself that way the whole way through. So.
And that's actually the last thing I wanted to mention before we get to kind of our quote list here and just read some of the good ones. Is that Churchill, being an amateur historian, he's not professional. He doesn't have his PhD by any means, which makes you a professional historian on paper. And he realizes that when he writes. I think when he writes his histories, if you read them, it's so much. He obviously is I like to write about things I like to write about. And he sort of picks and chooses what he writes about too. And he's also conscious of being not a professional historian. He often would talk about the fact that he feels out of his league, but he really is a good historian. I love to read his stuff because it's entertaining. He embellishes, it's stories and then crazy language, and he'd be the guy that you'd want to have sitting right next to us right now on the show talking about history, right? The way he talks about it,
absolutely.
So to kind of end with some great quotes, this is actually one of my favorites because it illustrates him as a person. This is from World War I, and he wrote this in a letter privately, and he said, "I think a curse should rest on me because I love this war. I know it's smashing and shattering the lives of thousands every moment, and yet I can't help it. I enjoy every second of it." Imagine that gets out in the newspapers.
Well, yeah, that would be the end of him.
Yeah.
Because I know it physically took its toll on him as well. He spent sleepless nights pacing and trying to figure out strategy and working with coalition and allies. But it's one, it also provides him a great opportunity to be a great leader. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what he's getting at, is that, and again, it goes back to that, putting what's good for you personally ahead of what's good for the group or other folks or even your family.
So to kind of end the show, we have some good quotes from him. Success is not final. Failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts. it's always
It's a great quote for the classroom, isn't it?
I've read that one a few times. You have enemies good, that means you've stood for something in your something sometime in your life. I like this one. Men occasionally stumble over the truth, but most of them pick themselves up and hurry off as if nothing ever happened. If you're going through hell, keep going. I like this one a lot. My tastes are simple. I am easily satisfied with the best. I like that one. History will be kind for me. I intend to write it. I love this one. Success is stumbling from failure to failure with no loss of enthusiasm.
And that's the one you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, that one.
I think that best describes
it's him. Because his life is up and down. I like this one too. Tact is the ability to tell someone to go to hell in such a way that they look forward to the trip. That's something he would do. Here's a great one. This is the classic, and I think we have to end with the show on this one. It's great. A lady came up to me one day and said, "Sir, you are drunk." To which I replied, "I am drunk today, madam, and tomorrow I shall be sober, but you will still be ugly." That's
nice.
That is Churchill to a T. You could definitely not say that today. Okay, but that's going to do it for us today. We wanted to keep it short for the show. Make sure you get your questions to us at holleyhistory65@gmail.com or even tweet us at holleyhistory. Be sure to subscribe to the show. You can click on it right at the bottom corner. And we hope to have our next episode out to you soon, but we're going to need some more questions, so get those in. And this is Nick DeMuro and Mike Crissman signing off from the Holley Central School Library. Thank you for joining us for Holley History.